At the previous level, we saw a closed operating cycle. Guilt bends behavior, shame silences the voice, and fear keeps people staying even when the heart longs to leave. These emotions require no commands. They transform themselves into inner discipline. Tonight, we go even deeper, because when emotions are already under control, even affection can be shaped into a tool. Not to soothe, but to bind. Carl Gustav Jung understood that human beings are not guided only by pain. They are also guided by the hope of being loved. For this reason, the most refined forms of control do not always punish. Sometimes they give. A timely embrace, conditional approval, tenderness that arrives, then withdraws. Jung warned, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, their love is lacking." When power appears in the form of affection, love is no longer a free meeting. It becomes a means. Shaped affection does not arrive to heal. It arrives to condition behavior. It teaches you that you are loved when you play the right role, at the right moment, with the right emotions. And when you fall out of rhythm, warmth is withdrawn, quietly, without explanation. Jung identified this as emotional conditioning. Love becomes the reward. Distance becomes the punishment. No orders are needed. No threats are required. The nervous system only needs to learn to predict. Stay, and there is warmth. Step away, and there is cold. In Jungian psychology, this is especially dangerous because it targets a primal attachment need. Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important." When affection is given conditionally, people learn to cut parts of themselves away in order to preserve connection. They call it maturity, sacrifice. But in truth, it is bondage wrapped in velvet. Tenderness, when controlled, no longer expands the soul. It narrows the range of living. You become more cautious with words, more restrained with desires, quieter with what is most true. Jung wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. Facing the truth that affection is binding you hurts far more than continuing to adapt." What is most tragic is this. Those bound by affection often believe they are choosing freely, because warmth makes everything feel consensual. But Jung reminds us that freedom is not measured by comfort, but by the ability to be fully present without having to trade away one's identity. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. When affection operates unconsciously as a tool, it is not recognized as control. It is called love. Tonight, we do not rush to conclusions. We need only one gentle observation. Which tenderness allows you to expand, and which tenderness makes you contract? That question requires no action. It merely opens a narrow seam of light. And within that seam, we begin to distinguish between soothing and binding, between love that liberates and affection that demands a price. And it is precisely at the moment when affection begins to feel like absolute safety, no longer questioned, no longer examined, that a more subtle form of binding quietly unfolds. Excessive warmth. Love bombing does not begin with cruelty. It does not arrive as a threat or overt control. It begins with warmth, with intense attention, with words that flow easily, without hesitation, without restraint. Presence becomes so constant that emptiness has no chance to appear. You are seen. You are chosen. You are made to feel unique. And for that very reason, no alarm bells ring in the mind. Everything feels right. Everything feels as though it was waiting for you. The psyche responds immediately, without reflection, because being cherished activates something ancient in the human nervous system: the need for connection. Before human beings learned how to reason, they learned how to cling. Before they learned how to question, they learned that abandonment meant danger. Jung understood this layer deeply. He saw, within every adult, a primal child still searching for signals of safety. Signals that say, "You belong." And when those signals arrive in the form of overwhelming affection, the mind does not ask why. It simply exhales. Jung wrote that the psyche always longs for wholeness, a sense of unity with something larger than the fragmented ego. He said, "The psyche is a self-regulating system that maintains its equilibrium just as the body does. When affection touches a part that was once neglected, it brings a feeling like the return of something lost. Not merely being loved, but being reassembled. An inner void suddenly feels filled, without effort. At this stage, nothing feels wrong. There are no signs of threat. No boundaries are violently crossed. There is only a smooth current of attention and affirmation. And because of that, the mind calls it meaning." Jung wrote, "Man cannot stand a meaningless life. When a connection brings the feeling of fullness, of being chosen, of being needed, it easily drapes itself in the garment of destiny." Love bombing works not because people are naive, but because it strikes at an archetypal longing. Jung called this longing conjunctio, union. In the unconscious, the intensity of affection can be felt as a silent promise. I will no longer have to be alone with my broken parts. And when that promise is felt emotionally, rather than understood rationally, it bypasses every analytical barrier. The danger lies here. In the early stage, love bombing does not need deception. It only needs speed. Speeding up intimacy, speeding up attachment, speeding up the sense of we. Jung understood that when the psyche is rushed too quickly toward union, it has no time to establish boundaries. And boundaries, in Jungian psychology, are the prerequisite for individuation. He wrote, "Individuation is the process by which a person becomes an individual, that is, a separate, indivisible unity, or whole. When boundaries have not yet formed, union does not lead to wholeness. It leads to dissolution. At this stage, the person being love-bombed does not feel possessed. They feel cherished. They do not feel controlled. They feel understood. And because that feeling touches the deepest layers of the need to belong, it is not questioned." Jung warned, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls." Facing inner emptiness is far more painful than allowing a stream of affection to fill it. Love bombing, therefore, does not require hidden intent. At the beginning, there may not even be intent. There is only the interaction of two unconscious processes, one offering affection to feel power and union, the other receiving it to feel safe and valuable. And within that meeting, both can believe they are living something profoundly real. Jung did not deny the healing power of affection. He simply warned against confusing wholeness with fusion. Wholeness allows two individuals to meet without losing themselves. Fusion causes one person to disappear into the warmth of the other. And the boundary between the two, at the stage of love bombing, is exceedingly thin. At this moment, nothing needs to be exposed. Nothing needs to be concluded. Only one very gentle awareness is enough. Where does this feeling of meaning come from? From the meeting of two mature individuals, or from an old inner emptiness that has just been touched? Jung believed that this question, when held quietly, will slowly reveal its own answer. And when affection no longer merely brings the feeling of being met, but begins to fill every inner space, another subtle movement appears, not of love, but of intensity. What makes love bombing powerful is not love, it is intensity. There is no space to breathe, no pause to feel, no distance for the mind to return to itself. Everything arrives too fast, too full, too continuously. And within that flow, the psyche has no time to integrate experience. It is not invited to understand. It is submerged. Carl Gustav Jung understood that the human psyche is not designed to receive intimacy at a forced speed. The psyche needs rhythm. It needs intervals of stillness to distinguish between emotions arising in the present and old memories that have just been activated. Jung wrote, "Emotion is the chief source of all becoming conscious." But he also knew that when emotion exceeds the capacity to contain it, it no longer leads to consciousness. It leads to overwhelm. In love bombing, there is no space for questioning. Not because one is persuaded by arguments, but because the nervous system is overloaded. When attention, affirmation, intimacy, and presence are compressed into a short span of time, the mind enters a state of saturation. And in that state, discernment does not speak, not because it agrees, but because it no longer has the energy to respond. Jung described this as a condition in which the ego is swept into a current of unconscious energy before it has had time to establish boundaries. He warned, "The psyche is not a machine that can be driven at will. When pushed beyond its natural rhythm, the psyche does not resist with reason. It shuts down certain functions in order to survive. And one of the first functions to go offline is differentiation. At this level, it is easy to mistake saturation for attachment. But Jung would stop early to make a distinction. This is not yet attachment. Attachment requires time for two egos to meet, collide, adjust, and still retain their own form. Saturation is different. It dissolves boundaries through intensity. It floods the ego with emotion until it no longer knows where it ends and the other begins. Jung wrote of individuation. Individuation is the process by which a person becomes an individual, that is, a separate, indivisible unity. But saturation does the opposite. It creates the illusion of union before the individual has had time to become themselves. And that illusion is easily mistaken for love, because it carries the sensation of fullness, abundance, and the absence of lack. When the psyche is submerged, everything feels right. Not because it is right, but because there is no space left for questions. Jung warned, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. In a state of saturation, pausing to ask, 'Is this happening too fast?' becomes more uncomfortable than continuing to drift along the emotional current that seems to be carrying you. The subtle danger is this: saturation does not hurt at first. It numbs. And that numbness is interpreted by the mind as peace. But it is the peace of an overloaded system, not the peace of grounded presence. Jung understood that when emotion is driven too high, consciousness does not expand. It contracts to protect itself. And in that contraction, the boundaries necessary for inner freedom never have the chance to form. Love bombing, therefore, does not need deception of content. It needs only tempo. A tempo fast enough that no one notices what is being exchanged. Jung once said, "Where love rules, there is no will to power. But when intensity replaces love, power begins to operate quietly, not through domination, but through overload. Saturation creates dependency before choice. It convinces people they have found what they need, when in truth, they have not yet had the time to ask who they are within this bond." Jung emphasized that real meaning appears only when experience is integrated, not when it overwhelms. Man cannot stand a meaningless life, but a life that is too full to be understood becomes empty in a different way. So the point here is not to morally judge love bombing. Jung did not do that. He simply invited a subtle distinction between intimacy with rhythm and intensity without space. One allows consciousness to grow. The other silences consciousness through overload. When you begin to notice that you have no time to feel, to sense your body, to return to your own rhythm, that is not a sign of deep love. It is a sign of emotional saturation. And in that very small moment, when you manage to take just one slower breath, a new possibility appears. The possibility for discernment to return. No decision is required. No action is needed. Only a very small space. For Jung, it is precisely that space, not intensity, that is where consciousness begins to live again. And when intensity has saturated the psyche so completely that there is no longer any space left for discernment, it is the sudden silence that follows, which truly takes control. Then, without warning, something shifts. Not through conflict, not through harsh words, but through a very quiet withdrawal. Messages slow. The warmth that once felt abundant becomes sporadic. The attention that seemed limitless turns conditional, sometimes present, sometimes absent. No explanation. No clear ending for the mind to place a full stop. And it is precisely this ambiguity that strikes the deepest blow. The psyche does not register this as an ordinary loss. It registers it as danger. Human beings can endure sadness, but unpredictability is far harder to bear. Carl Gustav Jung understood that the human psyche requires stable patterns in order to feel safe. When a source of affection that was once consistent becomes erratic, the nervous system does not label it as change. It labels it as threat. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. Yet there is something nearly universal. Unpredictability shatters inner safety. When you no longer know where you stand within a bond, the mind enters a state of heightened vigilance, not because you have lost the other person, but because you have lost the emotional reference point that once oriented your reality. What is most painful is that this withdrawal is rarely named. No one says, 'I am pulling away.' No one says, 'Something has changed.' There is only a gradual cooling, and the mind is forced to fill the silence with assumptions. Jung understood that in such unexplained gaps, the unconscious takes over. And the unconscious never chooses the gentlest narrative. It chooses the one that maximizes survival. The fear that is activated is not primarily the fear of losing the other person. It is the fear of losing predictability. When something that once felt stable becomes inconsistent, the psyche regresses to a very ancient question. What did I do wrong? What must I do to make the warmth return? And so energy no longer flows outward toward living. It turns inward, toward self-monitoring, self-adjusting, self-shrinking. Jung described this as the moment a complex is activated. He wrote, "Complexes are autonomous psychic entities. When an abandonment-related or threat-related complex is triggered, it does not wait for rational analysis. It seizes control. The nervous system enters watchfulness. The mind becomes signal-obsessed. Every delayed message becomes a sign. Every silence becomes an unspoken verdict. And here, manipulation requires no further action. The withdrawal itself is enough, because it creates an inner loop. The more unpredictable it becomes, the more fear arises. The more fear arises, the tighter the attachment. The tighter the attachment, the more the self is lost." Jung warned, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. In this state, people are willing to abandon intuition, boundaries, and even dignity, just to recover the sense of safety they once felt. What makes this stage especially dangerous is that fear has no clear form. It is not the fear of being beaten, starved, or overtly attacked. It is the vague fear that what was good might return if one does the right thing. And that suspended hope holds a person longer than any chain. Jung understood that hope, when left hanging in unpredictability, can become a subtle instrument of control. He wrote, "Hope is the dream of a waking man, but when hope becomes attached to an inconsistent source of affection, it no longer opens the future. It immobilizes the present. It keeps a person waiting, adjusting, self-blaming, not because they are weak, but because their nervous system is desperately trying to return to a state of safety it once experienced. At this depth, the psyche no longer clearly distinguishes between love and survival. Every action is measured by a silent question. Will this bring the warmth back? And when that question becomes central, inner freedom quietly disappears. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Those caught in this loop do not call it manipulation. They call it trying, preserving, not making things worse. Unpredictability thus becomes the most powerful catalyst of fear. It does not strike directly. It destabilizes the ground beneath one's feet. And when the ground becomes unstable, human beings cling to whatever once provided safety, even as it withdraws. Jung saw in this a familiar psychological tragedy. We cling to the past to avoid the anxiety of the present. Yet he also emphasized this: the moment fear is named correctly, as fear of unpredictability, not fear of worthlessness. A small opening appears, not for immediate action, not for abrupt separation, but for recognition. The body is reacting to emotional danger, not to objective reality. And that recognition alone, however fragile, begins to slow the spiral. Because when the psyche realizes it is afraid, rather than loving more deeply, the capacity for discernment, once drowned by intensity, begins to whisper again. Not loudly, not conclusively, just a very small sensation. This no longer feels safe for me in the way it once did. For Jung, this is not full awakening, but it is the beginning. And when unpredictability has awakened the most primal fear, what follows is no longer mere emotion, but a mechanism that locks itself shut. This is where the trap closes. Neuroscience has observed a phenomenon that appears paradoxical. Intermittent rewards are more addictive than consistent ones. When warmth no longer arrives steadily, the brain does not let go. It chases. Not through conscious thought, but through survival instinct, because what once provided safety has become unreliable, and that very unreliability turns every small signal into a powerful promise. In this state, the brain is no longer seeking pleasure. It is seeking the return of safety. A brief message, a fleeting moment of tenderness, an unexpected spark of attention, all are magnified. Not because they are great, but because they are rare. And each subsequent withdrawal becomes unbearable because it threatens the memory of a once stable state. You are no longer responding to the present. You are responding to a memory. Carl Gustav Jung would say that, at this point, the psyche has formed a complex. Not a single thought, but a constellation of emotions. Memory, hope, fear, desire, fused together and beginning to operate autonomously. Jung stated clearly, complexes are autonomous psychic entities. Once a complex becomes autonomous, it does not wait for your decision. It pulls attention, directs emotion, and commands behavior, while the ego still believes it is choosing freely. What makes this dangerous is that a complex does not need logic. It only needs activation. A small warm signal is enough to light up the entire constellation, unleashing a surge of hope. A brief silence is enough to cast a shadow of fear, and the loop reinforces itself. The rarer the reward, the stronger its pull. The stronger the pull, the deeper the obsession. Jung warned, Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Here, fate is not an external destiny. It is the internal rhythm of a complex at work. Within this trap, the mind stops asking what is healthy. It asks only how to make the feeling return. Moral judgment, personal boundaries, even one's own needs are pushed aside. Because the complex has redefined value, immediate emotional safety matters more than long-term integrity. Jung understood that when this happens, the ego is not weak, it is overwhelmed and trying to survive. Neuroscience speaks of dopamine. Jung spoke of psychic energy. Different languages, the same reality. Energy becomes drawn into a single point and loses its freedom to circulate. Jung wrote, "Where your fear is, there is your task." Where energy is pulled most forcefully is often where the complex is ruling. And because it rules through memory, not the present, the person begins to live out of time, reacting today to what once was. The subtlety lies here. The complex disguises itself as hope. Hope that this time it will be different. Hope that if I do it right, the warmth will stay. That hope is not morally wrong, but it becomes psychologically dangerous when detached from reality. Jung said, "Man cannot stand a meaningless life. Yet meaning injected through intermittent reward is not integrated meaning. It is addictive meaning, keeping the person suspended in waiting." Here, the trap closes through three simultaneous locks: the memory of safety, the rarity of reward, and the fear of unpredictability. Together, they form a self-operating engine. No commands are needed. No threats are required. The complex does the rest. Jung called this identification with the complex, when the ego merges with the emotional constellation. At that point, the person does not say, "I am being pulled." They say, "I am trying." But Jung never leaves us with diagnosis alone. He offers a quiet exit, making it conscious, not cutting ties impulsively, not judging oneself, but facing the truth that you are reacting to memory, not the present. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." When the complex is seen as a structure, not as deeper love, it begins to lose its absolute authority. Consciousness does not dismantle the trap instantly, but it loosens the hinge. It creates a pause between stimulus and reaction. And in that pause, a new question can arise, not to decide, but to orient. Which past is this pulling me toward? Jung believed that this question alone, held in calm awareness, is already a healing act. Because when you see that each small sign of warmth is being amplified by a complex, you stop confusing intensity with meaning. When you see that each withdrawal feels unbearable because it touches a memory of safety, you stop blaming yourself for being too sensitive. You begin to see the mechanism, and seeing the mechanism is the first step toward freedom. Jung reminds us that complexes are not enemies. They are parts that once tried to protect, but when they rule, protection turns into imprisonment. What you resist persists, Jung wrote. Therefore, the way forward is not to fight the complex, but to integrate it, to return memory to its proper place so that the present can regain the right to guide. The trap closes through intermittent reward, but it opens through discernment. No dramatic decision is required, only a small recognition. I am being pulled by memory. For Jung, that moment, fragile yet real, is precisely where inner freedom begins to return. And when the trap has closed, when the memory of warmth begins to govern present reactions, we reach a more subtle and painful layer. The suffering is no longer tied to the person in front of us, but to something that is no longer here, The Stoics warned early on that suffering does not come from loss itself, but from clinging to what is no longer present. Epictetus stated plainly, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of things." It is not the event that hurts us, but the way we continue to hold its image in the mind. Love bombing, however, creates a dangerous distortion of this attachment. It does not bind us to a specific person, but to a state, a moment in time when everything once felt whole, safe, and meaningful. Carl Gustav Jung understood that the human psyche does not first crave another person, it craves wholeness. He wrote, "The psyche is a self-regulating system that maintains its equilibrium just as the body does. When an experience of affection awakens that sense of unity, the mind remembers not the details, but the feeling. And when that feeling disappears, the psyche does not interpret it as ordinary change. It experiences it as an imbalance that must be corrected. Here lies the tragedy. People do not stay because of the other person. They stay because of the memory of a version of reality that once existed." Love bombing engraves a moment in which all questions fell silent, all anxiety paused, and the self felt sufficient. Jung would say that once the psyche has tasted that wholeness, it will do many things, endure many things, just to feel it again, not out of weakness, but out of the instinct to restore balance. The Stoics called this the error of placing value in what no longer lies within our control. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The greatest obstacle to living is expectancy, which hangs upon tomorrow and loses today." When the mind lives in anticipation of the return of a past state, the present is abandoned. Every moment that does not resemble the memory is experienced as lack. And thus suffering is not only maintained, it is prolonged. Jung adds another layer. This attachment is often unconscious. People believe they are persevering for love, when in fact they are striving to return to an inner state that once soothed an old loneliness. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. When the memory of wholeness operates in the unconscious, it becomes a distorted compass for the present. What must be recognized is this: that state belongs to time. It no longer belongs to the person, nor to the relationship as it is now. No action in the present can authentically recreate a moment that has passed." The Stoics did not teach people to erase memory. They taught them to loosen identification with it, not by force, but by the clear awareness: this is no longer here. Jung likewise did not ask us to abandon memory. He asked us only to place it where it belongs. Memory is part of the story, not the one holding the wheel. When memory ceases to command, the present finally gains the chance to speak. And in that moment, suffering begins to ease, not because the old state returns, but because we are no longer compelled to live for it. Love bombing does not bind us through the present. It binds us through a moment that has already passed. And the first step toward freedom, according to both Jung and the Stoics, is not forgetting that moment, but recognizing this quiet truth. It is no longer a place where life can continue to be lived. And when attachment no longer points toward a person or the present, but anchors itself to a state that has already passed, what follows is almost inevitable. The mind begins to live in memory rather than in the life that is actually unfolding. Imagine standing in a warm room. The light is soft. The air feels complete. Your body relaxes without needing to stay alert. Then, without explanation, you are led out into the cold. No conflict, no declaration. Just the door closing quietly behind you. You are not chasing the room. You are chasing the warmth. Because what you lost was not a space, but a state. Carl Gustav Jung would say this is the moment the psyche becomes caught in an inner image. A person is no longer responding to the reality in front of them, but to the memory of a wholeness once felt. Jung wrote, "The psyche is a self-regulating system that maintains its equilibrium just as the body does. When balance is abruptly disrupted, the mind does not move forward into the present. It tries to return. And so you wait. You hope. You begin to adjust yourself, your words, your emotions, your needs, to deserve the return of that warmth, not because the present is unbearable, but because the memory is irresistible." The Stoics understood this mechanism with striking clarity. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The greatest obstacle to living is expectancy, which hangs upon tomorrow and loses today." When the mind suspends itself in anticipation of the past returning, the present grows dim. Every moment that does not resemble the warm room is felt as lack, even if it is, in truth, sufficient. Jung saw here a subtle shift of the ego, from presence to waiting. Waiting is not neutral. It is an inner posture in which agency is paused. A person no longer asks, "What do I need now?" They ask, "When will the warmth come back?" And in the meantime, they begin to shrink. What is painful is that they do not realize they are changing, not to become more authentic, but to fit a memory. Jung would call this identification with an unconscious image. He wrote, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." And here, the idea, "I was once chosen, once held in warmth," begins to have the person. It shapes behavior. It rewrites boundaries. It whispers, "If I am good enough, the door will open again." But that room no longer exists in the present. It exists in time that is already closed. And no adjustment of today's self can faithfully recreate a moment that is past. The Stoics would say, this is where suffering is cultivated, when we demand that the present return a feeling that belongs to the past. Epictetus reminds us, "Do not seek to have events happen as you wish, but wish them to happen as they do happen." Not as resignation, but as liberation from self-imposed waiting. Jung adds another depth. The seduction of memory lies not in its beauty, but in the fact that it serves as proof that you were once whole. And because humans long for wholeness, they are willing to stand in the cold for a very long time, just to keep the hope that the warmth will return. Jung wrote, "Man cannot stand a meaningless life." That memory gives meaning, but it is the meaning of the past, not of the life unfolding now. In this state, hope becomes a tether. Not hope for something new, but hope for repetition. And each time the present fails to deliver, the mind does not ask whether the hope is misplaced. It asks what it has not done well enough. Jung recognized this question as the sign of an ego turned inward to self-monitor, self-blame, self-adjust, instead of living. What matters to see is this: you are not pursuing a person. You are pursuing a feeling. And that feeling, though once real, no longer belongs to now. The Stoics would say, freedom begins when we return to time what belongs to time. Jung would say, healing begins when we allow memory to take its rightful place, as part of the story, not the one holding the wheel. When you realize that you are standing in the cold not because the present is too harsh, but because the memory is too compelling, a small opening appears. Not to reject the past, but to return to your body now, to your breath, to your real needs, to the honest question, am I living or am I waiting? Jung does not ask you to destroy hope. He only reminds us that hope must be placed where it belongs. Where your fear is, there is your task. What you fear most may not be losing the warmth, but accepting that the room belongs to the past and that another source of warmth must be built from another life, one that is more faithful to the present. You are not chasing the room. You are chasing the warmth, And when you see that clearly, a new choice quietly emerges: to keep waiting in the cold of memory, or to begin building a different warmth, not from the past, but from your own presence, here, today. And when we realize that we are standing out in the cold, not because the present is harsh, but because the memory of warmth is still too vivid, a deeper truth quietly reveals itself. And here is that quiet truth. What keeps us stuck is not pain, but the memory of having once been loved. Not who someone is now, with their withdrawals, conditions, and unpredictable absences, but who they seemed to be when affection felt limitless, when presence was whole, when nothing had to be earned or fought for. Carl Gustav Jung understood that the psyche does not first attach to another person. It attaches to a state of wholeness once touched, and the memory of that state, when nurtured in silence, can hold us more tightly than the suffering happening in the present. Jung wrote, "Man cannot stand a meaningless life." The memory of being loved carries meaning. It proves that once, the ego did not have to contort itself to be worthy. It simply was. And so, when the present no longer offers that experience, the mind does not ask, "Is this still healthy?" It asks, "How do I get back?" And that very question pulls us out of the present, relocating us into another time, another image, another version of a person that no longer exists. The Stoics warned long ago about the suffering that arises when we cling to what is no longer present. Marcus Aurelius reminded us, "The greatest obstacle to living is expectancy, which hangs upon tomorrow and loses today." Here, expectancy is not only about the future, it is about waiting for the past to return. When memory becomes the measuring stick, the present always loses. Every moment now is compared to then, and therefore, nothing is ever enough. Jung adds a deeper layer. This memory is not merely recollection. It can become a complex, a constellation of emotions operating autonomously. He wrote, "Complexes are autonomous psychic entities. When the memory complex is activated, it directs attention, magnifies hope, and blurs discernment. We no longer see the person in front of us as they are. We see them as a symbol of a time that has passed. And symbols are never held accountable by reality. What keeps us staying, then, is not pain. Pain can push us away. What keeps us staying is the belief that the warmth might return, if we are patient enough, flexible enough, correct enough." Jung warned, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls." Facing the truth, that memory is no longer a place we can live, hurts far more than continuing to hope. But tonight, nothing needs to be resolved. Jung never rushed toward decisive breaks. He understood that becoming conscious is already a powerful shock to the nervous system. He wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And so, instead of forcing action, he invites something humbler: recognition. Simply recognizing that what is holding us is not the present, but the memory of having once been loved. That recognition does not demand conclusions. It does not require cutting ties. It merely puts memory back in its rightful place. Memory is part of the story, not the one holding the wheel. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." When the shadow of memory is brought into awareness, neither worshipped nor denied, it loses its secret power to rule. At the next level, we will explore what happens when connection becomes the sole source of reality, when the inner world feels valid only if someone else reflects it, and when isolation begins to feel safer, simply because it is predictable. Jung understood this paradox well. When connection is turned into a measure of worth, people may choose isolation to escape the torment of uncertain hope. But not now. Now is the time to rest. Rest is not avoidance. Rest is allowing the mind to loosen without needing to understand everything. Jung believed that many deep transformations occur when consciousness temporarily steps aside, in silence, in sleep, where the unconscious continues its work of integration. So tonight, allow one very gentle thought to remain. Perhaps I am being held here by the memory of having once been loved. That thought does not need to be solved. It only needs permission to exist. And now, rest. Sleep.